Did you know Montel uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to forecast spot prices, inflow to reservoirs, wind and run-off river production? We can improve forecast for your individual power plants anywhere in Europe. Contact us at ai@montelnews.com for more info.
Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. In this final episode of 2020, we'll take you on a little tour around Europe to sum up what happened this year and to look forward into 2021, once, hopefully, we leave COVID-19 behind us. Joining me in the first part of today's episode is Nathan Witkop, Germany correspondent at Montel, and Siobhan Hall, correspondent in Brussels. A warm welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Siobhan, if I can start with you, what were the main events this year, do you think? Obviously COVID, but, I don't know, from a Brussels perspective, what were the main issues this year?
So, obviously it's been a very unusual year, but actually I'm only going to pick out one thing that is significant from this year. That actually happened just this month, and that was EU leaders deciding to back having a target for the EU to cut its emissions by at least 55% on 1990 levels by 2030. And this endorsement by the EU leaders will basically drive all the policy measures that we're expecting to come out next year. So it was a really significant agreement, and it still has to be made binding through negotiations with the European Parliament. But we already know that the European Parliament was pushing for a target of 6% below 1990 levels. So we can assume at this stage that minus at least 55% emissions target is going to be the absolute minimum of the emission cuts that we can expect the EU to sign up for.
Excellent. I mean, did COVID-19 slow down the wheels of the policymakers in Brussels? Did it have any kind of impact, would you say, Siobhan?
Well, the EU quarter in Brussels was a lot quieter than it normally is. But actually, no, the timetable pretty much went as I would have expected. So everyone switched to Zoom meetings. I saw that Germany had the EU presidency, which was driving the discussions on the 2030 climate target. And I heard that most of those people stayed in Brussels. Unusually, most of the other delegations went away, but the German delegations stayed in Brussels and worked it out. So it was more difficult, but it didn't slow things down significantly.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And Nathan, you're based in Bonn, the former capital city of Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany. What were the main events in Germany this year?
Well, I mean, I could probably flow in there from what Siobhan was saying, because she did reference there the German EU presidency. And I think, if anything, COVID sped things up in terms of the green transition, because, we got this goal through this year. We also got through a massive stimulus and funding package, and I think that kind of allowed countries like Poland to entertain these kinds of high ambitions. So I think we actually got a lot of movement this year, in part because of COVID, because this time around, in contrast to the global financial crisis, there was a determination to build back better. And that, I think, facilitated a lot of ambition when it came to things like, okay, let's finally get the ball rolling on hydrogen. Let's get the ball rolling on offshore wind. I mean, this year's been a massive year in terms of targets for developing things like offshore wind and, the technologies that will complement renewables down the track. In Germany, of course, probably the biggest standout thing for Germany alone was the coal exit law. This year, Germany passed this historic law to finally leave coal generation. It's less ambitious, perhaps, than some countries' pace of leaving coal, but you have to bear in mind just how central coal has been to Germany's economic development and how central it has been until very recently as well. So, Germany plans to close its last 39 gigawatts of coal capacity by 2038, potentially as early as 2035. I personally think that it will probably end up leaving earlier, as the pressure to leave will only mount over the coming years. And as we've seen this year, the goal itself seemed controversial because it looked as though Germany could close a lot more coal a lot more swiftly, as we saw perhaps from the first round of tenders for the first plants that are supposed to leave the market this year.
Was there anything that sort of surprised you in the tenders or anything interesting that came out of there, Nathan?
Well, what was interesting was as soon as they were announced, or as soon as the first round closed, Vattenfall already flagged, yes, it had submitted its brand new Moorburg coal plant in the bid. So that's two 800 megawatt units, so 1.6 gigawatts of brand new hard coal capacity that was only built 5 years ago or so, or completed 5 years ago. It had already applied to receive compensation to close this year. So a stunning destruction of capital in a sense. But that says a lot about what utilities think the prospects of coal are in the coming years, if they're already closing some of the most efficient coal plants out there. So they flagged that, and then the results of the tenders became known at the start of this month. So in addition to Vattenfall's Moorburg plant, RWE also submitted a bid successfully for its Westfalen E unit, and that's almost another 800 megawatts, which means that together with Moorburg, around half the first round of tenders for hard coal plant closures for this year were highly efficient plants built within only the last 5 or 6 years. And it spoke volumes about how little room there is for coal in the future energy mix, if even the utilities that own these things think that brand new units won't be able to survive.
No, I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, I think incredible moves there. Maybe, even if we get on the back of what Siobhan mentioned there, the 55% reduction in emissions, that we get very stiffer carbon prices, we could maybe see some of these units leave the market before 2038. But Siobhan, if I can turn to you again before we talk about next year, I know we've discussed this a little bit between ourselves in terms of hydrogen, but has the way that green hydrogen has shot to prominence, has that taken you by surprise at all?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's really surprising seeing how something went from a very, very niche product, even just a few years ago, and now it is a massive billboards everywhere talking about hydrogen. It's really what everyone is interested in. And one of the reasons is because hydrogen has the capacity, in principle, to replace a lot of the gas and oil demand, which means that the big oil majors are interested, which means there is a lot of money ready to flow into hydrogen. And the European Commission and Germany is very keen on green hydrogen, which would be produced from renewable power, which is an interesting market driver for more renewable energy demand and more renewable energy production, and linking to what Nathan was saying about developing offshore wind, which could be then used to produce green hydrogen on the coast and put into gas pipelines and sent to demand centres. So there's a lot of interaction between the hydrogen market or potential hydrogen market and renewable energy demand. But it's going to take a while. They're incredibly ambitious targets, like to have 6 gigawatts of electrolyser capacity to produce green hydrogen by 2024, so not very far away. And going up from there, it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out, because there is a potential, if there is renewable electricity needed to produce hydrogen, and there's also renewable electricity needed to help with the minus 55% target on electrifying new sectors and so on, then that's a lot of new demand for electricity, renewable electricity. And so that could have an impact on prices.
Absolutely. And if we look forward now, Siobhan, it's going to be quite a busy 6 months, is it not? Or maybe 6 to 12 months. I mean, wouldn't you say, in Brussels? What's on the agenda?
I'm going to say it's going to be a busy 3 years, is what I'm going to say.
Fair enough, absolutely. Yeah.
But you're referring to the fact that the Commission will come in June 2021 with a massive package of legislative proposals in order to make this minus 55% target achievable.
Absolutely.
And that's going to involve changing the EU emissions trading system. So that could have an effect on carbon prices. The goal would be to have an effect on carbon prices. It's about raising the targets for renewable energy and improving the EU's energy efficiency. So again, that's going to be promoting renewable electricity, but also in heating and other sectors. The energy efficiency is likely to reduce demand, like a higher energy efficiency target is likely to reduce demand more for gas. So renewable electricity would end up having a bigger share overall as fossil fuels reduce. There's also plans for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which again is going to be linked to carbon prices somehow, or the ETS and so on. And that's about making products produced in the EU under a stricter carbon regime, ensuring they're still competitive with products produced outside the EU under less strict carbon regime. And the interesting thing there is that EU leaders want that mechanism in place by the 1st of January 2023 at the latest. So normally it takes a couple of years to get new EU legislation agreed and in place, but that implies they want to go quickly on this package. So even though it's enormous and they're looking at lots of different things, and I would normally say, well, that means it's going to take at least a couple of years, it sounds like there's going to be lots of intense work to make it ready quicker than it might normally be.
Interesting. I think because obviously it's going to keep you very, very busy in the weeks and months ahead, Siobhan. But how about in Germany? What's on the agenda here? What can we expect in 2021?
Well, we still have to see what the rest of 2020 brings. I mean, bearing in mind that as we speak, it's around halfway through December, and we still don't have a reform of the Renewable Energy Act agreed. It has to go through by the end of this year. We still have to clarify what's going to happen with all of the onshore wind turbines that started receiving feed-in tariffs 20 years ago under the first Renewable Energy Act law. And those tariffs are due to roll off at the end of this year. And that means from next year, we could start to see around 4.5 gigawatts of old turbines simply retire unless it's clarified what happens with how they can earn money. So because they're so old and because power prices took a very big hit this year, it's not clear if they can make enough money through PPAs. There's supposed to be some form of bridging mechanism agreed within the latest Renewable Energy Act reform to guide them through this period so that they can be either updated and upgraded at the sites where they are into new wind turbines. But even there, the issue is that new turbines don't necessarily have or can't necessarily get the same approval to exist where the old turbines are, because nowadays wind turbines are significantly bigger, goes with the efficiency, and they don't necessarily have the same permitting to be that close to settlements or wherever they're located. So there is a mess. It's supposed to be cleared up with the reform of the EEG right now, but that reform still hasn't been agreed. It was supposed to be agreed in November, and the wind industry fears that we could lose above 4 gigawatts of wind next year very quickly unless something is agreed.
Nathan and Siobhan, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard.
Well, listeners, it's time for part 2 of our whirlwind trip around Europe. In this part, we will talk to Chris Eales, editor France, Andres Cala, who's editor Spain, and Olav Vilnes, who's chief editor for the Nordics and the Baltic. So a warm welcome to you, Chris, Andres, and Olav.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. It's always nice to come onto your podcasts.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard.
Excellent. I think if we can start with you, Olav, we're both sitting here in Oslo. The idea today is to talk a little bit about what happened this year and what were the important developments in the Nordic and Baltic markets. Of course, COVID is number one, but apart from COVID, what can you say, Olav?
I think what everyone thinks, when you go out of 2020, of course, COVID is what everyone is talking about. But I think also if you talk about the power market in the Nordic region, definitely the low prices. I mean, you haven't seen lower prices in this market for 20 years, and that's almost as long as it has ever since it has existed. Average prices around 10 euros. It was close to 40 1 year ago. And I looked at the 10-year average, which is close to 36 euros. So it just tells you the magnitude of the low prices. And that, of course, has hit earnings of producers. It has caused concern for people who want to invest in the future if they can get as well paid as they previously expected.
But this is just a temporary blip, do you think? Or is this situation going to last into 2021, 22, 23?
I think the bearishness is quite strong if you look at the next few years, because there's a lot of wind coming online. A lot of new wind parks being invested across the region. You have high renewable targets in all Nordic countries. On top of that, we have seen very mild winters recently, so the demand is also quite low at wintertime. So I think in the short term, the risk of very low prices are high. If you look beyond 2025 into 2030, there's a lot of new demand coming in, so that can lift prices further out. We're talking about hydrogen, we're talking about data centers, battery factories, even transport will use a lot more electricity than it does today. So I think all those things are pointing towards maybe a more balanced power market 10 years from now, but at least for the next few years, there will be a big surplus of power. So if it gets wet, mild, you will get low prices.
Yeah, and just looking out the window, it's wet, mild, grey, and pretty depressing. Really.
It is. I haven't used my skis for 2 years almost in Oslo, and that's quite unusual.
Absolutely. A lot of the market is putting all its bets on a very some very bullish forecasts for demand in terms of what you've just mentioned.
They do, and they also vary quite a lot. Really, they do vary. They disagree a bit on what will drive prices, but of course. The price formation in the Nordic power market will very much follow that in Germany and continental Europe because you have increased transmission capacity. There will be a lot of new cables coming in. You had the first ever connection between Norway and Germany, which has already led to some high spot prices in southern Norway during hours with a lot of import. When there was a lot of export, and there was high prices in Germany. New cable to the UK next year, and altogether, of course, these things will help balance out prices and also give them some support.
So if we move over from Norway to the Nordic region to France, Chris, what were the big stories in 2020, of course, apart from COVID?
Well, I mean, if you want me to talk about France apart from COVID, then I will have nothing to say.
Well, okay, then if you must, Chris, do sort of touch on COVID then.
What we have here, it's called the COVID rhythm, and it goes like this. Fear, chaos, confusion, spike. That's what we've had in France all year because of COVID. And that is what is likely to carry on, as far as I can tell, because nuclear power in France is so important and it's so important for the rest of Europe. So we can't ignore the COVID impact. Of course not. I have to talk about it because French nuclear has such a big part to play in price formation.
So, Chris, that's a nice catchy phrase you've got there. Can we have the individual components? So the fear, what's the fear of? Fear of the virus or fear of...
First of all, of course, you fear you've got this terrible disease. What's going to happen? We don't know. Then you have chaos because EDF suddenly says, well, hang on, look, power demand has plunged 20%. So we have to adapt our nuclear reactor planning for all this. We can't use all these reactors, so we have to turn them all down. And then you have confusion because the market doesn't know what the hell is going on. And you have different messages coming from EDF telling you, well, tomorrow, potentially we're going to have, in one example, we're going to have 4 reactors that will be switched off. But then nothing of the sort happens, and traders up in arms saying we want some clarity from the producers about what is actually going to happen. And all this leads to spikes in prices.
But doesn't that happen every year?
Yes. Okay.
What's different this year?
Well, it doesn't happen to the same extent, does it? You don't have a 20% fall in power demand. You don't have one of Europe's leading power producers cutting their forecast nuclear output by 30% to 300 terawatt hours. Those kind of things do not happen in a normal year. So perhaps you can argue, yes, and that COVID has exaggerated everything else that's the underlying issues in France around peak demand. That's for sure, and will continue to do so, I think. That's been the major driver right through the year, and continues to be.
So are there any bright spots, though, Chris? Is it all a bit sort of gloomy and chaotic and confusing?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a bright spot, actually, if you like. Not that long ago, EDF actually said in terms of unplanned outages at their reactors that there were fewer unplanned outages in 2020, so it was up till about November, I think, than there were the year before, which is quite surprising in a way. So that's interesting. They say they're learning from the past and difficulties they've had meeting aging challenges and maintenance work. However, for that to remain, of course, unplanned outages are things that are unforeseen. I might suddenly explode. Now, we can't prevent that.
Thanks for that. I think I'd like to go a little bit further south. Andres, if we can ask you about 2020 in the Spanish or Iberian market, apart from COVID, what were the other major issues? Or was it just COVID like it was in France?
Well, Richard, no pun intended, but the sun shines brighter in Spain than in France, apparently.
I don't think that's true at all.
Yeah, COVID obviously must be part of the story, but we, in Power, we recovered demand rather swiftly, considering just how bad it's been, well, at least in two occasions in the two waves. While the rest of Europe today is grappling with the second wave, we're already making plans for the third wave, so to speak. But it's been resilient, certainly in Power. Gas demand has never fully recovered, mostly just because Spain is an export-driven economy, which means, industrial output is still struggling to get back to normal levels, just because of the global economic downturn. But it will get there, undoubtedly. And I think the highlight of 2020, at least, was at the beginning, it was very uncertain how much of the government's plans, and this applies also not just to Spain, but also to Portugal, how much of the Iberian region plans will come to fruition. And we had very ambitious plans ahead of the COVID pandemic, that in regards to green capacity installations, to green tenders, to regulatory objectives. We had a lot of plans, and COVID ran the risk of derailing a lot of this. In any case, we actually met all of these objectives. On the regulatory front, the government managed to pass all the necessary, to grease the wheels, so to speak, to set everything in motion. We redirected the huge stimulus money that will be forthcoming next year. Most of it will go into the energy transition, which is encouraging. I mean, that's where everything is riding on. It's not just 2020 or 2021. We're talking about the Spanish plan for a full industrial re-revolution, so to speak. And the entire economic apparatus is shifting gears, and it's all around energy. A lot of it is green, obviously. There's a lot of solar, a lot of wind. We're even starting to consider offshore wind, which it wasn't even the case even a year ago. So it seems there'll be smooth sailing, going forward. As I said, the tenders are a welcome addition. 3 gigs a year, 3 gigawatts a year of green power. That's a huge, not just huge target, but that's just tenders. Considering everything else, we could have as much as 6 gigawatts a year for the next at least 6 to 7 years. And that's huge surge in power generation that will go, a lot of it, to hydrogen. Obviously, our demand will not grow at the same pace. That's without even considering COVID. But it will go into hydrogen. It will go into storage. It will go into re-gearing the Spanish economy.
Excellent. So it seems there's a huge amount of development going on in the Iberian market. Very exciting times, and maybe I hope some of our listeners are aware, we've also expanded journalistically in these markets, hiring new people because we are so keen on covering these very fast-moving events. But Andres, if I can ask you, what would you wish for in 2021, energy-wise?
Energy-wise, I think just a continuation. I think the entire market has been very positively struck by the ability, not just of the government, because at the end of the day, obviously, this is a parliament that has reached a consensus. It is just about the only thing that there's political consensus in Spain. So I think my wish and that of the energy sector would be a continuation of that, both regulatory-wise, money flowing, private investments flowing, foreign investment is flowing, certainly domestic investment is flowing. The industrial part is meeting its goals. It's the whole shuffle that we've been going through, not just because of COVID, but actually for an entire decade, it's finally, it seems to be coming to an end. And if anything, COVID catalyzed that. It allowed our leaders to realize we need to get our act together, and they did. And I think what I wish for is a continuation of that, not just next year, but going forward.
That's fair enough. I mean, how about in the Nordics, Olav? What are going to be the chief drivers in 2021? More of the same? The weather, oversupply?
It's always the weather, isn't it? I mean, it's last year we had a quite normal hydro situation at this time of the year. This year we have 20 terawatt hours in surplus of storage. So it means low prices. So I guess if you ask a power producer, what he would ask for is a very cold winter with a little no snow, no rain, just very high consumption. But of course, interestingly, there's also a lot of things happening in the political space as well, which can be quite interesting next year. We have the Swedish another nuclear reactor that shuts down at the end of this year. We have already seen that prices can spike quite quickly there when there is a shortage of nuclear capacity in the south of Sweden. And the price differences internally in the Nordic region has been huge this year, varying from less than 10 in Norway to 30 euros almost in Finland and Denmark and southern Sweden. So I think that for a journalist, it's nice. It's interesting with all these variations, the ups and downs, but of course for market participants, probably more stability in a sense and more clarity. But at the moment, there are many uncertainties. Weather is one of them, COVID another one, and then of course the carbon market, which is also spiraling and is affecting all the power markets around it.
Absolutely. What would you wish for 2021, Olav?
I would wish for a very sunny year. I don't used to make many wishes, but I think my main wish would be a lot of news. An interesting year, controversial statements, and prices that goes up and down, so we can have a news story every day.
Absolutely. And on that note, we were just about to hire a new Nordic reporter as well for your desk, so I think that's great news. So that will hopefully, I'm sure that will amplify the nature of the reporting that we're doing and increase the coverage of this very key market. How about in France? What's your view of 2021? Is it more chaos, more confusion, more fear, or are we coming to sort of more onto an even keel?
I don't think we're coming onto an even keel. I hope we're not, otherwise we'll have nothing to write about. What I can safely say, what I think I can confidently predict, is that this time next year, all this will seem like last year. Other than that, I think that, maybe we'll see the back end of COVID and then we can get on with the main event, which is the environmental destruction continuing of. But no, the usual drivers in France will be the weather, with January and February looking very tight. So that's people looking at that. And possible changes to nuclear regulation in France, the sale of EDF's nuclear output, with a decision expected on negotiations between the EC and EDF over a new nuclear regulation and potentially a change in the structure of EDF. And so, any changes to the AREN rate are market drivers, So that's something to look out for. Next year as well, there's a large number of 10-year visits, There are 4 40-year visits. 40-year visits next year. That means that they're the 4th 10-year visits, just to confuse people completely. That's quite important because the 40 years, reactors were designed to last 40 years. So if you have a 4th 10-year visit, that means that they've been around for at least 40 years. So you've got 4 of those. Those tend to be very long and could be complicated. So that's something to look out for, and that could be a driver because that could mean more nuclear unavailability next year.
Are they spread out over the year, or are they kind of all in one particular
I don't
period?
know the dates. I haven't got them off the top of my head, but it's quite a volume. That is, in total, there are 6 10-year visits, but 4 of them are 40-year ones. So I think that's quite interesting. What else? Well, yeah, the EPR discussion will go on, although there's no decision expected next year on that's not coming until after the elections in 2022. But this ongoing discussion about whether France can build new EPRs, that's obviously interesting and a driver in terms of the future power mix and how France intends to meet or to continue being able to export its power, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and along with these, I talked about potential changes to EDF. Along with that, we're seeing strikes. Yesterday, union-backed strikes cut French power capacity by 9 gigawatts. So these strikes are gearing up now. That's quite significant. And there's a real opposition in French Parliament and among energy unionists to the planned restructuring of EDF. So watch out for that.
Chris, what would you, if I ask you the same as I asked Olav and Andres, what would you wish for in 2021?
Well, I'd probably wish that, I can keep my job.
We'll come back to that. Yeah.
No, I wish peace and love. What else is there?
Okay, Chris, thanks for a nice roundup of what's happening in France. That's all, listeners, from the Montel Weekly podcast for 2020. Many thanks to Andres, Chris, Olav, as well as Nathan and Siobhan for this special Outlook and Review episode. Please tune in to the Montel Weekly podcast every Friday. We'll be back in early January. And remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in the energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. And in the meantime, wishing everybody a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.